And as the just noted, this is being recorded and you will be able to get a copy of it within the next week or so. The Leisure Management Special Interest Group was established several years ago, and this is one of our initiatives to provide information to our members in the wider industry. Today's webinar is about managing safe places for leisure. Now, just as a quick note, and I think there's something up on the chat, but some of you might be using a link that actually has you registered as Maria Iglesia, and we know you're not because she's not here. So can you just rename yourself when you get a chance? And that way we have a better idea of who's joined us. So let me spend a little bit of time just to introduce the faces you'll see and hear. So Joanne Zimmerman is an associate professor at Texas State University and co-chair of the Leisure Management SIG. Antonio Bramante is a member of the World Leisure Board and an active collaborator with Joanne and me as we organize the LMSIG's activities. Isabel Verde and Maya Suarez are work in the World Leisure Secretariat and provide support for the Leisure Management SIG to be able to function. We also get lots of support from Maria Iglesias in the Secretariat. And our special guest today, who I'll introduce in a few minutes, is Dr. Corey Johnson, Karla A. Henderson Distinguished Professor of Social Justice at North Carolina State University. Corey will share his insights about making safe places to address the needs of LGBTQI2S+ communities. And I'm John Tower. I'm the co-chair of the Leisure Management SIG and an honorary fellow at Victoria University in Melbourne, Australia. Before we get started, it's a custom in Australia to pay respect to the traditional owners of the land. I respectfully acknowledge the traditional owners of this land. I'm on Wurundjeri land in the Kulin Nation. I value the culture, relationships to country, kinship connections, and journeys of the first peoples of this land. I pay respect to the traditional elders, past, present, and emerging. So welcome to my country. We have the chat function for anyone in this session to share comments or questions. Joanne will be monitoring and sharing any of your comments via the English chat if we see how we go. And Bramante will be monitoring the Portuguese. He's a great translator into English if we need to discuss it that way. So if you feel more comfortable raising your concerns in Portuguese or maybe Spanish, then Bramante will be able to help get your question to Corey. The format today is a 20-minute conversation with Corey followed by your comments and questions via the chat. I'd like to welcome Dr. Johnson to the Leisure Management webinar. Corey's inquiries focus on power relations between dominant, white, male, etc., and non-dominant populations in the cultural context of leisure, and is also a qualitative research methodologist. He's co-authored seminal texts such as Fostering Social Justice for Qualitative Inquiry, a methodological guide, Promiscuous Perspectives, Sex and Leisure, and Contemporary Issues in Leisure, among others. His current funded gender-based violence on dating apps, or his current funded projects focus on technology-mediated social relations, including decreasing gender-based violence on dating apps like Tinder, Bumble, and Grindr. He enjoys hiking, camping, cooking, yoga, meditation, travel, and spending time with his husband of more than 20 years and Frenchie Sedgwick. The aim of the webinar today is to raise issues about meeting the needs of the LGBTQIS2+ communities and discuss how leisure managers can deliver safe places for inclusive leisure experiences. Before we start, I want to foreshadow that we have some questions for our participants to consider towards the end of the seminar. Welcome, Corey.
Yeah, thanks, John. Thanks for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
Okay, so let's get a start. I'll start sharing screen again. And we'll get into our first question. We know that addressing the principles of diversity, equity, and inclusion are important. Can you explain why making safe places is so important for the LGBTQI S2 plus communities?
Yeah, John, thanks for that question. First I want to say my pronouns are there with my picture and my name in Zoom. They're he, him, his, and I'll certainly give you more of a resource to talk about pronouns as we wrap things up. But I think your question is a good one, John. We're talking a lot about equity, inclusion, diversity. There's lots of language wrapped up in that. We also talk about social justice. And so when we talk about that in generality, that's great. But we also have to talk about the unique characteristics of social identity categories that often fall under that umbrella. And when it comes to the LGBTQ2S plus community, and the acronym can be a mouthful for sure. We can unpack that a little bit. But when we come down to why this conversation is even important, it comes down to heteronormativity and cisnormativity. And what I mean by that is this assumption that everyone is heterosexual or everyone is cisgender. And what I mean by cisgender is that the gender of yourself, your psychology matches perhaps the gender that you express on a daily basis. Regardless of that terminology, the assumption that people are cisgender or heterosexual has us create systems that then perpetuate prejudice, oppression, marginalization, discrimination. And those things happen at a lot of identity categories, but when they happen in the rainbow community, I'm going to use that language for now, what we see is increased stress that's often related to microaggressions. Again, these are that assumptions when I walk into the classroom and a student asks me, what my wife does for a living because she sees my wedding ring. That is a microaggression. It's not intentional. It's not out to hurt me, but that assumption requires me then to unpack the non-normative aspects of my gay identity. Other things like negative life events, stigma, the internalized oppression that comes with that. We often see things like physical abuse, people kicked out of their homes, kicked out of schools. All of these things create social stigma that says, if we're going to be effective leisure service managers, we need to make sure we have spaces that LGBTQ2S plus people can feel included. And that's what the safe space movement is really all about.
Okay, so to help those of us that aren't as familiar with that, can you give us some fundamental definitions for the LGBTQIS2 plus communities to help us understand the context for making safe places and how to start the conversations in our organizations?
Yeah, I'm going to start with the acronym, right? L, lesbian, G, gay, B, bisexual, T, transgender. If we've got a Q, it's likely queer or questioning, and the 2S is two-spirit. We add the plus because there's other identities that could fall under that umbrella that get sort of cumbersome. And so we're not going to address all of those identities today. But I do have sort of 5 or really 3 or 4 pieces of language that seem to trip people up a little bit. And so I always offer as an entree for comfortable conversation, the ideas of sex, gender identity, and gender expression. Now, sex, most of us feel really comfortable with because it's grounded in biological features. But that biology is essentialized, right? Because what we know is that for the most part, we expect people to be men or women or male or female. Now, male or female, this is the associated language that's associated with sex, whereas man, woman, is typically associated with gender identity. Now, if sex is the biological determinant, gender is the social script that we follow. And gender identity is the social script inside our head, our psychological sense of self. How do we feel inside? And gender expression is then the characterization of masculinity and femininity, and all of those things in between. So gender expression certainly can be something that's played with. I could wear a tie to emphasize my masculinity, or maybe even grow a beard, whereas I might wear a dress to emphasize femininity. So this is the idea of gender expression. And again, a reminder, gender identity is a psychological sense of self, and sex is rooted in biology. Finally, I want to introduce the idea of sexual orientation or sexual identity. And this is bound up in sort of attraction, right? Who we might be physically attracted to, whether that be women, men, or other sorts of genders, or who we might be emotionally attracted to. So again, this starts to get us into the territory of sexual identity, which is really important for us to sort of differentiate as we have the conversation with our LGBTQ2S plus participants and those that might be working with them.
Okay, so you use the concept of making spaces. Why does that concept capture how we should be thinking about LGBTQIS2 plus inclusion?
Well, look, the safe space movement has been around for a long time, really growing out of a safe space movement started in feminism, right? That created women-centered spaces. So women could address things that were pertinent and meaningful to their lives, different and distinct from men, and also to critique the patriarchy. Well, you know, safe spaces in the LGBTQ2S plus movement are very similar. They're spaces that allow people to feel both psychologically and physically safe so that they can explore and express their LGBTQ2S plus identity. So it's really important that we sort of pay attention to what the safe space movement can do, especially if we're going to think about leisure and recreation as an important space for that self-expression, that identity development, that time away from work and home that allows us to derive pleasure and also perhaps meet that special someone in some cases. So the reason I have shifted the language to making spaces versus safe spaces, and it's not to abandon safe space terminology, it's just to have us constantly thinking about it. And that is to constantly evaluate who is in the space, who it's created for, and how we can constantly make it more inclusive. So a great example in the safe space literature is that we can note, at least in North America, that most safe spaces are, most safe LGBTQ2S plus spaces are white spaces, are spaces filled with able-bodied individuals. And so we need to consider intersectionality. Where does sexual identity and gender identity intersect with our race, our class, our gender, our age, all of those things? And by focusing on the intersections, we can make space that is constantly reevaluating itself to make sure all of its members feel safe, and those people who have not yet joined the space feel like there's an entree towards their inclusion.
All right, so one of the things that we're really keen to explore in this is the whole issue around managing safe spaces, and thinking that we're in our leisure management focus. So what are some of the issues and challenges that people responsible for leisure programs, facilities, and services should be considering in terms of how they deliver making safe spaces, safe places programs?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'd start out with what we just said in the last slide, and that is terminology seems to generate a lot of fear among people for just having dialogue, right? Because it's like, oh, I don't know if they're gay or queer or 2S, and the acronym seems to keep changing on me, and I haven't had a class or any workshops or trainings that help me sort of understand this. So I'm just not going to deal with it as opposed to offending someone. And that's the problem with the political correctness around language, right? And instead, we need to embrace the fact that we might make mistakes, but that we're in it to learn. Then we can sort of move through the terminology, because honestly, that terminology is always changing. And so I think we're on to the next slide, John. That terminology is always changing. So what it does is it prevents lots of different challenges and perspectives. So the SIG group here, you know, they had a big challenge ahead of them trying to get me to talk about terminology in less than 5 minutes, when, you know, normally I would spend 2-3 hours just on that one slide. So again, seeking out opportunities, and I'm going to give you a resource at the end that allows you to sort of a glossary of types. Also, it's super important. I know I'm talking to a global audience. So it's super important that you know the legislation, policies, and laws that exist in your country in an effort for you to best support the LGBTQ2S+ population. So for example, in the state of Georgia, the last state where I lived in the United States, they could fire me, not at my university, but at any other job in the state that didn't have special protections. They could fire me for being gay. And so knowing that allows the service providers in my area to perhaps be more cautious sometimes in terms of how out they celebrate my identity beyond the scope of traditional trainings and that sort of thing. So knowing the legislation and policies are really important. Understanding how to promote and have inclusive dialogues. Also involving people. I think this is one of the most critical aspects, involving people who have lived experience. So if you're creating a safe space program, or you're revisiting an evaluation of your current safe space program, one of the things you might do is say, well, how are our trans identified participants being served? Do they feel supported? Or are we mostly responding to the lesbians and gay men in our community? So just making sure that you are asking people with lived experience to contribute to your program. Also, and we're going to end with this today in just a few minutes, as a matter of fact, you gave everyone a heads up that they're going to respond in the chat to some questions. So, you know, what are your own personal strategies that you're going to use to create more affirming environments? It might be something as simple as me putting up a rainbow flag on my door. Or it could be me going to the department head and asking if we can make sure LGBTQ identities are represented throughout our curriculum. These are ways to make sure that our personal strategies are connecting to the movement. And then finally, you know, we have to ask ourselves, are we really equipped to deliver, to plan and organize a Making Spaces type program? There's nothing wrong with saying, I am not yet educated enough to do so. But then you have to go out and get that education, right? It's not enough to say that I don't have enough. But if you don't, please get trained up before you start to create environments that might not be as affirming or respectful as you hope.
Okay, and I just want to reinforce, I think you said to us in one of our earlier conversations that your normal Making Spaces training program goes for a couple of days, and all we can hope to do is raise issues here about some of the things that people need to think about. And obviously that if they want to work in that area, they need to do, as you're saying, is making some initiative to get trained on that, just as we did decades ago for inclusion for people with disabilities and gender inclusion and all of those sorts of things. So, you know, we're just making a start here, and that's what our
John,
webinars are trying to do.
That toe dip is so important. This webinar is so important because it provides an opportunity, a low stakes opportunity. If you know you're going to spend 2 days with me, it's a very different attitude than if you know you're going to spend 20 minutes listening to me, right? But this is where it starts. These are how the conversations get going. And so I'm just grateful that you all have created a platform where topics like this one can be taken up by world leisure managers.
Okay, so I guess the other thing is that there are other things. You mentioned intersectionality and some of those. What are some of the other important issues to consider?
Yeah, so if we're back to like the start of our conversation where I emphasize part of what the issue is related to oppression, discrimination, marginalization of the LGBTQ2S plus community is heteronormativity, heterosexism, and then I think I will add to that homophobia, which we understand is sort of the fear, irrational fear or hatred of the LGBTQ2S plus community. But there's some other things, issues to consider that make safe spaces more complex. Some of those things include responding to communities of color. What the rainbow community looks like, and at least how we've characterized it in most of the Western world, is a very white perspective. And as we've done in other aspects of life, we are trying to be better in LGBTQ management practices and scholarship to better understand communities of color. Right now, most things, most research, most practices are grounded in white communities. And so if we understand the nature of how heteronormativity and homophobia show up differently for people of color, then we can be more inclusive, we can be more responsive. And I mentioned intersectionality earlier. We also have to focus on breaking down the false dichotomies of religion and sexual identity. You know, at least in the United States, and I've spent 7 years in Canada most recently, there is still a lot of scripture. There is still a lot of fundamental Christian messaging that sets up a false dichotomy as if people in the LGBTQ2S plus community can't be Christian or can't be Muslim or can't be religious. And that's just not the case. We've got to minimize and diminish that false dichotomy to understand that there are many, many people of faith as part of the LGBTQ2S community. And we've got to stop allowing, in this case, the words of scripture to continue to marginalize or perpetuate hate. We also have to understand things like immigration laws. For example, nobody thought much about sending our LGBTQ2S plus students on co-ops to other nations when I was in Canada. We are a huge co-op school, so every other term, the students are out in the workplace. And yet, if I'm going to send a gay male to Egypt to do a co-op experience, he needs to understand that he can be jailed and killed for expressing his gay identity. So we have to understand things like immigration and laws. And I don't want to hit that point too hard, but it's super important. We've also spent the past 10 years really talking about bullying. And I'm just going to make a plug right now for the Georgia Safe Schools Coalition. You can go to georgiasafeschoolscoalition.org. It's not in your resources later, but I'm just thinking it's an oversight now. But they have lots of resources on bullying prevention. We have some documentary films on LGBTQ bullying there. And I would encourage you to take a look and use those resources as they are necessary. And then finally, it's just worth mentioning because historically, I have studied the gay bar as a leisure context. And it's interesting to see now what the relationship is between alcohol bars and this party don't party sort of dichotomy that has materialized with young people in the LGBTQ2S plus community. And so what that is about their relationship to alcohol, drugs, dancing. And as we know, the LGBTQ2S plus community is at higher risk for alcohol abuse, drug use, those sorts of things because of the discrimination, oppression, homophobia, that sort of thing that they experience in daily life. So these are just things to keep in mind as you're thinking through your own safe space program.
Okay, and we will share or introduce and be able to share some of those resources you mentioned. And if you want to add that Georgia one for us to add later on, Corey, that'll be great.
Yeah.
So we want the webinar to be more than a sit and listen session for our participants. So can you explain some of the questions you want the participants to consider? We're looking at their personal strategies here. So what can we do now?
what's great is here I am in this webinar sponsored by the SIG Management Group and World Leisure, and I've got some new information that Dr. Johnson has talked through, but normally we just walk away, right? And we sort of file that information away. But I guess we were in discussion during the planning for this webinar, and we really wanted to move people to action. So, but in this short time period, how much action can we offer? So we're going to offer some questions instead. And as I indicated, and John indicated earlier, we'd like you to populate the chat as soon as you're ready with the answers to these questions. Now, if you would like to be confidential, feel free to, sort of direct your chat directly to Joanne Zimmerman or one of the other facilitators, and they're happy to then add it on your behalf. But I wanted to give that opportunity in case people want to be accountable, but they don't want to do so in the larger room. So having said that, if you could just think for 2 minutes to identify the positive experiences you had at your organization related to LGBTQ2S identity. And that can be your identity if you share in those. But if not, it could be a colleague, a participant. What have you seen that's positive? And the reason I ask that question is because we often retreat only to the deficit, the things that are bad for the LGBTQ2S plus community. And the truth of the matter is there's lots of great things about being LGBTQ2S plus. And so we want to identify those positives. But the second question, and one that is probably more readily available, are some of the negative experiences that people have had. And then the big question, what do you think as an individual, you and your colleagues could do to make your organization more welcoming to LGBTQ2S plus individuals? And I'm going to give you a minute, but let's just start populating the chat with the answers to those questions.
Corey, while people are thinking for a minute, Jeff Walkley from Belgravia, he's a National Disability and Diversity Manager for Belgravia Leisure in Australia and New Zealand. He asked the question, is the Making Spaces program available in a shorter version and online to promote accessibility from anywhere?
That's a great question. I guess I'll respond in 2 ways. One is that we think it's very, very important to some extent for you to make trainings context specific. And so what I mean by that is the needs of my students at the University of Waterloo, a very tech-oriented campus located in Canada, is super different than the students here at NC State in the southeastern part of the United States who have grown up in the South with different racial relations and different sort of influences of religion. And so I guess the first answer to the question is it's so important for us to make sure that our trainings are developed context specific. So the real answer, the second part, is no, we don't have them sort of offered as a general framework, nor do we offer them online. Now, that's not to say that there aren't programs out there that do. And then the second part of your question is, can they be shorter? Sure. It always depends on what the outcome is. We found for our campus allies, we really do need a full 2 days to train advanced trainers. We can do sort of your typical ally in 1 full day. And that comes with lunch and lots of breaks and those sorts of things too. Now, that's not to say you can't cover a LGBTQ 101 language in an hour, hour and a half, so you can target your trainings for sure, but I think it has to ultimately connect to the outcomes and your goals for the training.
Okay, and I'm going to stop the share now, and we will start seeing people a little bit. So good to see everybody in the room that we can, and let's hear some of your comments and go from there. So Joanne and Bramante, please take us on this little journey.
Yeah, so there seems to be quite a few coming in on the English chat. So from a positive point of view. Jeff Walkley says celebrations in support of the LGBTQ plus community in venues during national days of celebration. A bunch of my students are in here. So they're talking about Texas State, where professors include their pronouns and why it matters on their email, that it's a small thing, but it matters to the students a lot.
A lot.
In terms of, then they talk about, and I didn't know this, so thank you, Jerica. Texas State University has clubs specifically for queer students, and they're called Queer Cats. Having a safe place to come together and talk about our lived experiences and how to uplift our queer siblings. I also had a professor offer students a free webinar. Thanks, Dr. Z. So gave me a shout out. So thank you, everybody. And then we've got the other side. Jeff Walkley also says anxiety, concern, apprehension approaching fear experienced by people transitioning. And dealing with that fear is challenging. It says, here's another one from Texas State. There's a therapy support group for those who are LGBTQ2S+. And that's where we end with the comments.
Yeah, I mean, I guess if I might, that last comment of Jeff on transitioning, just because he asked the previous question, Jeff, I would say, you know, at least a full half day of our basic training is allotted towards the trans experience, because this seems to be where most people are eager for information. There's been lots of representation of the LGB community, probably more LG. And so people are eager to learn more about trans identities, trans lived experiences. So in our campus workshop, we spend a full half day on that. And then we invite in a panel of trans students with lived experience to answer questions and dialogue with the participants. So this is, I think, the learning edge that most people are on is eager for conversations about the trans experience and how to be most inclusive and supportive of that.
Jeff, do you want to say what you wrote just now?
Happily, for what the organisation has done, Joe, I've written a bit, sorry. So Belgravia Leisure has policy and statements that confirm its support and commitment to welcome, support and include the LGBTIQ plus communities and social assets that staff can use to communicate their own and the organisation's support to the LGBTQ plus community.
Great, thank you. Corey, I would think that's a big thing, right? Having an organization be supportive enough that they've created some of these policies.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, in our rehearsal earlier in the week, I promised I'd mention to the group that the city of Vancouver in Canada has one of the most comprehensive and progressive trans inclusion programming and policies that I've personally seen from a sort of a local city parks and rec. But of course, you know, a little bit of a Google search and some other triangulation, you could probably find some others, but it's the one that I know of the most. And then, of course, looking to your own university campuses to see what access and what services they're providing to the larger community is also a breadcrumb that I have found useful as I try to engage as an ally in the work for specifically the trans, gender nonconforming and non-binary communities.
Okay, are there other questions or comments that people want to share?
I had somebody who asked if it'd be possible to post the questions again in the chat, and Jillian, I believe they're all in the chat. If you just scroll the chat bar, you should be able to see what people have put in there.
Mm-hmm. But does she mean the 3 questions from my slide?
Oh, good point.
That might.
I don't know, Jillian, which questions? Oh, from your slide, yes.
Yeah,
John, can you?
Okay.
That's what I meant. I just have a bad memory. I'm sorry.
No, that's
No
okay.
worries.
Can you put your slide up again?
John,
Sure.
It's the what can you do
And-
now slide.
Yep.
There we
you
go.
are.
Yeah, there we go. And in summary, it's, you know, what are some positive experiences? What are some negative experiences? And probably most importantly, in my head at least, is what can you and what can your colleagues do? And you know, it's great to hear some of the things that Jeff has been able to share about Belgravia Leisure and help add some context to that. Jeff, if I don't steal your thunder, but Belgravia is a company that delivers a lot of different leisure and sport programs across Australia. And in particular, from my experience, very involved with managing leisure facilities, aquatic and rec centers, and those sorts of things. And I'm not sure how many there are, but I would be surprised if there aren't hundreds of centers that are being delivering their services under the Belgravia Leisure banner. So they do a great job around the country for us. And I know that they're very involved with a range of inclusion initiatives, and Jeff's made his career part of that.
Mhm.
Okay, well, listen, we're not going to, you know, we'll still have chance for people to share comments, and the video will be up next week. And within the video, we're going to invite people to also share their comments and answers to these questions. And what I intend to be able to do in the next Leisure Management e-news is to share some of the other comments that people have provided us, so that we can start to see and grow and think about this. So I just want to take this last little step, Corey, for you to just give a bit of an overview about some of the resources that you have made available to us, and just give us a bit of an overview of what those things will do or how people can use them.
Yeah, my goal was not to overwhelm folks, because I know, like, a ton of resources, you look at that pile and you go, oh, I'll get to it tomorrow because it's too big. So I just wanted to give you something manageable. And again, I know that language is the biggest and first hurdle to people really seeking educational training around these issues. So I have provided you with a glossary that my husband and I put together. He also does a lot of safer spaces work. And so together we put together this glossary. It has most update common terms, but again, language is ever evolving, changing, and new language is materializing. And so just remember that is a snapshot of probably 2018 or 2019 in terms of where it's grounded. I've also provided you with a worksheet and a website on pronouns. A lot of people are curious about why we're talking about pronouns, about why they're important, and how something so simple that no one ever even considered before could be so important to a person with a different identity. So think closely about those pronoun resources. And then I've also, recognizing my own limitation, most of my organizational resources are US centric. And so I would encourage others to add to that resource list if there are international organizations that you would like to share. And then finally, I just want to make myself available to you for either consultation, conversation, or again, I offer these trainings on a regular basis. So if that's something you're interested in discussing further, by all means, reach out to me. I'm really excited to be here at NC State. It is a new position for me. So what that means is that my agenda is not blank by any means. I have lots of work to do, but I am starting to build partnerships, and it seems like now is the right time to contact me to do those sorts of things. So anyway, that's just a start. So email me and I'm happy to dialogue. I'm happy to unpack scenarios, as I have done with the American Camp Association, with US Extension Service, with all sorts of youth serving organizations. 4-H is another. So, I can meet your organization where they are in terms of development, both your staff and your own, and we can see how to support one another to make sure that your community members have a place that they feel safe.
Okay, and we'll make those documents with this video recording over the next week in terms of people getting access to things. And We have your contact details from your registration, so we'll let you know when that's available. And you've got Corey's contacts, and we've got a number of other people.
Sorry, John,
Sorry,
there's
Joanne?
one more question I think is a pretty important one. It says, when dealing with an organization with low funding, what are some cost-effective ideas that would provide a safe space?
Yeah, I mean, in my perspective, you need very little funding to execute safe space programs. You really need an attitude and training. And so if you can get those two things in place, you can start creating your safe space program. I had no budget at the University of Waterloo, and it's one of the Making Spaces programs I'm most proud of. And when I say no budget, I mean zero budget. I eventually was able to convince the Vice President of Human Rights, Equity, and Inclusion to make my stickers, which you see on this slide here, right up there in the right-hand corner, so that my allies and my trained individuals on campus could identify themselves. But that was the bulk of the cost for me in that program, was printing stickers. So I say, with the right attitude and the right education, you can start a safe spaces program right away. Visibility and representation are super important to the LGBTQ2S+ community. So little things like rainbow stickers and pride flags, and including lessons about historical figures that were LGBTQ2S in your curriculum, in your examples in the classroom or in your programs. All of those ways are ways to get started. And you'll be surprised by how the little things you do make a big difference. Just like Joanne's student said, pronouns on your email, you think, oh, it's just my email signature. But you wouldn't believe how many emails I get responding to my pronouns being included on my signature line. So it's a little thing, but it makes a big impact.
Okay, thank you for that. Any last other questions? All right, well, thank you to everybody for joining our webinar. Special thanks to Isabel and Maya and Maria and the World Leisure Secretariat. They do a great job helping us to do what we're doing here. Thank you to Joanne and Bramante, who collaborate with me as we develop and deliver these sorts of activities within the Leisure Management SIG. Extra special thanks to Dr. Corey Johnson for his willingness to share his insights about managing safe places for leisure. It's wonderful to have leisure colleagues who are willing to contribute their expertise to help meet the World Leisure Organization's mission of sharing leisure's capacity as a central force to enhance the human condition. Thanks to everybody. You'll hear more from us over the next week or so about this webinar. And that's it from us for now. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye all.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.